The Cold War was a scary time in the history of the United States. World War II had ended, but the threat of nuclear war loomed over the heads of the entire world. The threat was first felt through the 50s and 60s, but lasted almost 45 years. People built shelters or bunkers under the ground on their properties for safety. The threat was so real that even Life magazine had a shelter on the cover of their 1962 issue entitled "The Drive for Mass Shelters." This is the 1960s version of preppers. In addition to the fear of nuclear war, there was a general fear of communism and communists. They even made a movie about it. A boy enters a bunker when they think a nuclear bomb hits, and they don't come out for 30 years. So you may ask yourself, how did this happen, and what is a Cold War? If you may recall, or maybe didn't know at all, World War II ended with Japan being bombed by the US with 2 nuclear bombs. The threat of further nuclear attacks ended the war. The war was over, but the threat of war was hanging over everyone's head. So the Allies formed blocs, and they called them NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and Warpac, or the Eastern Bloc, or the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance. Now, you may ask, what does that mean? Well, an ally is a friend in a time of need, and that is what NATO is. A collective defense whereby its member states agree to mutual defense in response to an attack by an external party. The Warsaw Pact was similar. It was a collective defense treaty among 8 communist states of Central and Eastern Europe in existence during the Cold War. All of this to say that if any country attacks another, their allies will come to their defense and pretty much throw the world into another world war. Thus the term Cold War, not a true war, but a war of fear, and even though it was backed by the Allies, the heart of the Cold War was between the US and the USSR, and between democracy and communism. There were many events that continued to escalate the Cold War, such as the Korean War in the 1950s. In an effort to spread communism, Stalin initiated the North Korean invasion of South Korea, and to his surprise, the UN Security Council backed the defense of South Korea. In 1959, the Cuban Revolution began and Fidel Castro came to power. He attempted to purchase arms from the Eastern Bloc and then turned Cuba into a communist government. President Eisenhower formally severed ties with Cuba, and this policy is still in effect today. During this time, the US and Soviet Union were in competition over everything. The development of nuclear weapons led to satellite technology, which led to the eventual Apollo missions and moon landing. This may not have happened for many years had long-range missiles not been developed. Long-range missile technology led to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. This was a 10-day standoff between the US and Soviet missiles placed on Cuban soil pointed at the United States. Those missiles were never fired, and the idea of mutually assured destruction is what prevented weapons of mass destruction from ever being fired during this 45 years of tense relations in most of the world. Though it was guaranteed that mutually assured destruction would ensure another war and possibly the end of the planet, the US and Soviet Union continued to make weapons of mass destruction at an alarming rate. Ronald Reagan, the 40th President of the United States, was determined to wipe out communism. He built up the US military in response to the buildup of the Soviet military. So you may ask, how did it end? How did we not end up at war? There are 2 truths. First, no one was eager to drop the first bomb after the long-term effects in Japan, but at the end of the day, it came down to money. In its race to build a huge military, the USSR ran out of money and their oil export money started to dry up. They were no longer able to maintain the power they once had, and their government collapsed. On December 26, 1991, the USSR dissolved and each country went its own way. The conversation turned to mutual disarmament and continues today.